Hello, everyone. Good morning. Oh, I don't have my lights on. Sorry, everybody. Good morning. That's a little bit better and a little bit too bright, actually. Good morning, everyone. It is ECM, as always, and I am happy to be here with all of you. As we did yesterday, we are streaming today on StreamYard, so please let me know if there's any concerns about audio or anything else like that, but we have been doing our very best here to kind of like improve viewer quality as we've gotten started back here on YouTube again live. First things first, I am Elizabeth Cronise McLaughlin. As always, I am coming to you live from occupied Tonga land in Southern California with barking dogs behind me who get very excited when I go live. Today, for our visually impaired friends, I am wearing a stripy gray shirt. Sorry, I probably just bumped my mic. With a waterfall light green sweater. I've got on these funky new gold flower earrings that I just picked up at H&M. They're kind of fun. And my hair is pulled back today, and I am a pink-skinned woman with green eyes, and I've got a little bit of makeup on today. And my hair is pulled back. Yeah. That's kind of it. All right. Welcome. So I want to thank everybody who watched and joined us live yesterday. Also, just want to mention to everyone that there is so much developing news around the indictments in Georgia and the ongoing potential criminal liability of the former guy that, you know, we're going to have kind of updated information rolling in kind of by the minute, I expect, over the next few weeks. So we are, as I mentioned yesterday, going to be live and public here on YouTube every Wednesday and Sunday now. Sunday morning's broadcast is a little bit earlier than usual. It's at 8:30 on Sunday morning, just so I don't kind of wreck my entire day with my kids. But Wednesdays will be at 9 a.m. And then if you choose to support us over on the Patreon, you can also get in on the private broadcasts that are now on Monday and Friday. So 4 days a week. And as I mentioned at the end of yesterday's broadcast, depending on breaking news, trial developments, and the like, there may be additional live broadcasts here. And depending on how things flow fundamentally as we get back into the loop of being live in public, it could be more. So we'll wait and see how this all develops. But I want to thank especially all of our longtime viewers who have been here for a really long time, because you all are the backbone of this broadcast. Many of you have been here from the very beginning, all the way back in late 2016, early 2017. And I'm just super grateful for all of your support and subscriptions and everything else over the last nearly 7 years. Donut and Sophie say hello as usual, and I apologize in advance for the snorts. Okay, I have another long list today of, yes, the times I gave. Carolyn, thank you for mentioning this. The times that I gave are Pacific times. So we are live here on YouTube and publicly Wednesdays at 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern, and Sundays at 8:30 a.m. Pacific, 11:30 a.m. Eastern. And then if you choose to subscribe over on the Patreon, we are also live at 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern, Mondays and Fridays. So if you're a subscriber 4 days a week, 3 of them are Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern. Sundays a half an hour earlier. Okay. So I hope that's helpful to everyone. Thank you for that reminder. Okay. I have a very long list today of issues to cover. Lots of great questions put on the Patreon feed this morning. By the way, if you are a subscriber over on the Patreon, you get an opportunity to ask questions in advance. That actually makes it more likely that I will address them on the live broadcast because I get a chance to prep and research and do all that other good stuff for a few hours before the broadcast starts. So let's just start with a primary breaking news story that dropped last night, which is that the New York Times reported that all the way back in January of this year, Jack Smith subpoenaed all of Trump's Twitter files, meaning not just the actual public tweets that he put out, but everything in his drafts and everything in his DMs, as well as all his location data and who authored them and whether or not he's got any back-end accounts where he might have been looking at things under the guise of, a kind of Finsta account, basically, but the equivalent for Twitter, like basically a private account or an account that wasn't public in some way or that didn't look like him, where he could have been trolling for things. So I'm fascinated by this story for a couple of reasons. The first is that I think we're going to find out a lot of very interesting things about how Trump located some of these more abhorrent and fascist memes that he was retweeting on when he was live on Twitter in advance of January 6th, and really honestly through the entire presidency, and how he had such quick access to them, even when they were from very small accounts. I'm also really curious as to whether or not any of the accounts that were feeding him information through DMs, or otherwise for that matter, are accounts from overseas. Because we have had this whole issue of disinformation and foreign interference, and there's all of these reports now, we're going back a number of years now, but of accounts that on Facebook and on Twitter that, for instance, look like Black activist accounts that were actually being run by Russians and white Russians, for that matter. A lot of disinformation being fed into accounts that looked like they were authored by American women, when in fact they were Russians, white male Russians, and that were designed to really create a very large degree of discord on the left. I'm also just tremendously interested in whether or not any of the communications in those DMs were government communications. Part of the reason why I'm interested in that is, of course, there are national security considerations that are very serious there. It would also be very interesting to know, like, what he was discussing in those DMs with anybody else. Now, the range, Roberta, just to answer your question quickly on this, the range of the subpoena that was issued is from 2020 until just around January 6th of 2021. I believe it goes all the way through January of 2021. So it's a limited window. And in essence, what it's seeking to do, because we know what the DC investigation is about, right, is to determine whether or not there was information being fed to him in DMs related to the organizing of January 6th. That is another reason that it's going to be really interesting to see what's in there. Now, the second thing that I'm really fascinated about by this story is that Twitter, under the management of Elon Musk, fought this subpoena so hard that the judge who was charged with administering the motion to compel compliance with this subpoena, all of this, by the way, was sealed and unknown until yesterday, ended up sanctioning Twitter $350,000 for lack of compliance. The other thing that apparently happened was that Twitter gave Trump, under Elon Musk, gave Trump a heads up that they had received the subpoena, despite the fact that they were specifically instructed not to communicate with Trump about the contents of the subpoena or the fact that it even existed, because there were fears about Trump's destruction of relevant evidence. So there is a huge amount of potential evidence that would result from the compliance with the subpoena. Now, we know that eventually Elon Musk's Twitter did comply with this subpoena and turn over information to Jack Smith's office. We do not know yet what is contained in what was produced. But all of this raises a very big question, which is, like, fundamentally, who was sliding into Trump's DMs and why, and what were they giving him? I'll add one other thing here, just specifically related to January 6th. Those of you who have been watching on the Patreon feed know that I've talked about this kind of endlessly since January 6th of 2021. But people seem to forget that there was a reporting, I believe it was by Jim Acosta, on January 6th itself, that people inside the White House were in communication with people who had invaded the Capitol building. And there was this report that the White House had told the press that they were expecting that the people who had invaded the Capitol building were going to be there overnight. I have had real questions since then, and particularly related to that report, about who was communicating with the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers inside the highest levels of the White House, such that they would know the plans, whether that was the day of or prior to. Now, we know that Roger Stone had a lot of communications with them. We know that the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys were even providing security to him on that day. But we don't know about the communications between the White House and those folks directly. And I am just really curious about whether or not any of this communication took place via Twitter DM. Now, for the person asking whether or not all of this is admissible, let me just add one thing here, okay? Whether or not evidence is admissible depends on the evidence. If, for instance, somebody sent Trump a DM that said, I heard so-and-so talking about the fact that they're going to invade the Capitol on January 6th. That's hearsay. And there will be questions about whether or not it can be admitted under a hearsay exception to the federal rules of evidence. However, if these are records kept in the ordinary business course of business of Twitter, if Twitter keeps a record of everybody's DMs, which we know that it does, none of Twitter DMs are not encrypted in any way, shape, or form. And Jack Smith can call the Twitter records custodian to the stand and authenticate those documents as legitimate business records. That's a hearsay exception. Whether or not they'll be admitted for the truth of the matter is another story. But, again, sorry, there's a fly in my office. However this plays out is really going to depend on what the judge decides to rule with regard to the admissibility of the evidence by the time we get to trial. And there's a lot of, each different DM could be subject to a different hearsay exception depending on what it says and who wrote it and how it got to him and all that other kind of stuff. And also, there may be certain instances in which Trump's team doesn't contest the admissibility of the evidence because that happens all the time. So we'll have to see how this all progresses. But this was very big breaking news overnight, and I personally am kind of fascinated to see where this goes. All right. The other bit of news is that Mark Meadows yesterday filed a removal petition for the crimes of which he is accused under the indictment filed by Fani Willis in Fulton County, seeking to remove the case to federal court. Now, I talked a little bit about removal on yesterday's breaking news broadcast. I did not talk about it in the context of this particular federal statute, which allows a federal official to remove any claims against them to federal court. Now, there are big questions about the applicability of this particular statute because Meadows is claiming that it was his role as chief of staff of the White House that would allow him to remove it. Big questions about whether or not, say, if you're organizing election interference to try to overthrow the democracy of America, you're actually acting within the scope of your employment as a federal employee. I have really big questions about whether or not this statute can be applied in those circumstances. But regardless, I want to answer some specific questions about what it would mean if Mark Meadows successfully removes the crimes of which he is accused to federal courts. Okay, so first things first, removal does not change the accusations against him from state to federal claims, okay? The crimes remain the same. As well, the prosecutor remains the same. So Fani Willis will still try a case against Mark Meadows, just in a different courtroom for the exact same crimes, all right? Many of you have probably seen that there's a lot of media coverage. I personally have this degree of speculation about whether or not a federal jury pool would be more favorable than a Fulton County jury pool. I'm going to remind everybody there are areas surrounding Atlanta that are far more white than certain counties in Atlanta. And one of the benefits of removing to federal court is that he may get kind of like a broader, more white, more conservative jury pool than he would be likely to get in a specific county. However, I'm just going to tell you all, I'm not sure that makes very much of a difference here. Fundamentally, he seems to think that he might get a fairer shake in a federal courtroom. Same crimes, same prosecutor, slightly different judge, right? I mean, again, I'm going to remind everybody it would be a federal judge, but we don't know who that judge is going to be. And there are plenty of appointees in Georgia who are appointed by Democratic presidents. And I'm going to remind everybody also, just because I said this yesterday, the judge who is overseeing the Fulton County case is a Republican appointed by Brian Kemp. We don't know who that person is going to be. And it could end up being a much more, experienced judge at the bare minimum, because we know the judge that has been assigned to the Fulton County case has only been on the bench since January. We don't know how that's all going to shake out. So it's a bit of a gamble on Mark Meadows' part to even do this, right? He is gambling on getting what he might perceive to be a better judge, and he's gambling on what he might perceive to be a better jury pool. But he's not going to be facing different crimes or a different prosecutor, even if he's in federal court. The other thing I just want to mention, because there was a very specific question about this, the fact that the case is going to be tried in federal court does not invoke the federal pardon power. Okay, the pardon power of the presidency applies to federal crimes only. The fact that he is going to be in federal court also does not change the fact that Brian Kemp or any other governor of Georgia does not have the power to pardon him in Georgia. We discussed this yesterday at length. So this is, I happen to agree with you, Carol. I think this is a very desperate move on Mark Meadows' part to try to seek a more favorable judge, perhaps, and a more favorable jury pool. but it's not likely to work in his favor. I mean, this is all very, very speculative on his part. So we'll see what happens next. The one thing I will say is that there may be an advantage to him being tried separately from the other defendants, but that doesn't mean that similar evidence might not come in. Now, is there going to be evidence of the specific crimes that say were committed by Sidney Powell? Actually, probably yes, because they were committed in furtherance of the RICO conspiracy. However, if there is a specific crime that is only alleged against, say, Sidney Powell or Rudy Giuliani, that is not alleged against Mark Meadows, the evidence related to that may not come into play. So if there is, an election official in Coffee County who scheduled a meeting room, the evidence about that is not going to come into play against Mark Meadows. But everything else that the RICO conspiracy undertook, fair game in federal court under state law, just in the same way it would be in a Fulton County courtroom. All right. So, it doesn't really change much for him at all. It may be something of a precedent. This is, again, not something that we would expect to see in the regular course of business in America, because, by the way, reminder, it's like there's never been state indictments against a former sitting president before, or his chief of staff in this way. So it's kind of anybody else's guess how this is going to go. Again, to answer this question, I'm just going to point out Fani Willis is going to be in charge of the prosecution, whether it's in federal court or state court. And, the evidence that will be admissible will be decided by the judge in that case. But I would not expect that, the 30,000-foot view of fundamentally a nationwide conspiracy to overthrow the results of the 2020 election is not going to be introduced in any case against Mark Meadows. He's alleged to have violated RICO as a part of the conspiracy, just like every other defendant. So I don't know that it really changes. I don't really think it changes very much. All right. Let me just answer a couple of other questions here related to, things about pardons generally. I'm going to remind everybody that even the federal presidential pardon power, again, does not extend to state crimes. There is no way, even if Trump is reelected, again, I'm just going to tell you, my prediction is that there's not a snowball's chance in hell that that's going to happen. But in the event that that takes place, he will not be able to pardon himself for any state crimes. And also, he can't pardon himself for any federal crimes. Now, I'm just going to say he may try. But I think that we're so far out of field in terms of speculation and various intervening events that would have to take place that it's not even really worth considering it at this moment. I'm also just going to remind everybody you can't pardon somebody until after they've been convicted. Mimi, just to answer your question really quickly about who decides whether or not a case belongs in federal court, it is a federal judge who will hear the notice of removal petition. And that is briefed just like anything else. I used to do this all the time, honestly, when I was a federal trial litigator. I handled removal petitions all the time. There will be motions filed by Fani Willis to deny the removal petition. And that will be litigated and argued. There will be oral argument in front of the federal court judge that is assigned to the removal petition itself. And that will be briefed. There will be oral argument, and then there will be a decision. Okay. A couple of other things. Yes, you're right. It wouldn't be on television, although I'm not even sure that that in and of itself is necessarily a guarantee. At this point, there is so much pressure on the federal judiciary to open courtrooms for television cameras. And I'm certain there's going to be motions filed by places like the New York Times, MSNBC, CNN, to make sure that they have camera access to any proceedings involving the former president or the chief of staff for that matter, because there's so much public interest in this. All right. Let me look at my list for a second. Okay, let's just talk about the jury pool issues as well, because there are very serious considerations here. I talked about voir dire and the process of voir dire for evaluating whether or not Trump's jury, a member of Trump's jury, a potential member of Trump's jury is going to be sat. All right. So the voir dire process, just quick summary reminder, is that both the prosecution and the defense get an opportunity to ask questions of any potential juror, to ask about any potential issues of bias, and they get a certain number of strikes. So one of the things that I want people to be aware of here is that there are obviously going to be voir dire questions no matter what of every potential juror in this case about whether or not they can be fair and unbiased, regardless of their political persuasion. But I'm also just going to say one other thing. If I was a prosecutor in this case, one of the questions that I would be asking every single potential juror is who won the 2020 election? Do they believe that Joe Biden is the legitimate winner of the 2020 election? And anybody who answers no to that question presumably has an unremediable bias against the prosecution of the case. Okay. So, you know, one of the things I always give this example, but I have to give an example from my own history. I was called to sit on a jury in the District of Columbia when I was in law school there. And it was a case involving drug dealing, a marijuana prosecution case where they had opened up the guy's trunk and there had been like huge kilos of weed in his trunk. And one of the questions that I was asked in voir dire was how I felt about the legalization of marijuana. And I said, I do work because I've been doing volunteer work during that time for legal services related to the Walt Whitman Clinic, which treats people with AIDS and HIV and is a huge advocacy organization in DC for gay men's health generally. And I was in favor of legalization at that time, not just because I hated the way that, you know, weed was being prosecuted, but also because the legalization of marijuana would have allowed so many gay men who had wasting syndrome from AIDS before we had all the current treatments that we have right now to find their hunger and be able to eat. And I was seeing in friends and colleagues in real time the benefits of that. So when I was asked that question in voir dire, I said, I'm sorry, but I think weed should be legal. And I think the way in which it's prosecuted and the sentencing standards that are applied to it are appalling. And they kicked me off the jury immediately. And, you know, like, I'm not surprised, right? Because what I said was that I didn't actually really think there was a legitimate basis for prosecuting weed in the way that they were prosecuting it. And also that I thought it should be legal. Right. So that's an example. It's like if you make a statement that that fundamentally says that, you know, you have a bias against the prosecution that cannot be remedied, you know, that's something that's going to get you kicked off of the jury regardless. OK, so that's that. Questions about, do unindicted co-conspirators know who they are? This is a funny question to me, but it made me laugh. I don't mean that it was funny or that it wasn't a legitimate question. It really made me laugh because, like, of course they do, right? If you've read the indictment, like, you know, and I encourage you all, you know, like, even though it's written in a fair amount of legal lingo, like, you can go read the facts of this and really get yourself kind of educated about what's exactly in the indictment. You know, there are statements in there that are like, unindicted co-conspirator was a part of a conversation where this defendant and this defendant said X. If you're the only unindicted co-conspirator mentioned in that paragraph, like, you're kind of going to know that it's you, right? Also, it's very clear that a number of these unindicted co-conspirators have already flipped. And that as well means that, of course, they know who they are. All right. Now, I want to be very clear. As I said yesterday, a number of these unindicted co-conspirators may not yet be indicted because there's a plan to indict them in the future. And if I was one of those unindicted co-conspirators, I would be ringing up Fani Willis's office like yesterday. Again, I just want to remind everyone that indictments are not written in stone. There can be superseding indictments. If evidence that is given by somebody who flips reveals additional crimes, those can be included in a superseding indictment. Additional defendants can be added to an indictment. So all of this is like a work in progress. And, you know, one of the things that I find very interesting about the history of the way that Fani Willis prosecuted RICO cases in the past, particularly when you look at the academic testing conspiracy case that she tried as a RICO case, is that that case started out with 35 defendants. And by the time she got to trial, there were 12. And that means that all those other co-conspirators and co-named defendants flipped and turned state's evidence. So there's a lot that can happen between now and a trial. And, you know, I don't know, man, if I was like unindicted co-conspirator number one, who was helping Trump to write the speech about how the election had been stolen on October 31st of 2020, before the election had actually taken place, I myself might be very concerned about whether or not I was going to be next on the list when another superseding indictment drops. So that's only one example, but yes, of course they know who they are. And I'm also just going to mention the grand jury knows who all these people are. It's stated in the indictment. Unindicted co-conspirator one, whose identity is known to the grand jury. And they do that so that there's not ever any allegation that they've just made up facts or made up witnesses or made up crimes, okay? The grand jury knows who all these people are. It was disclosed in the confidential grand jury proceedings that took place that resulted in the indictment. So none of this is a mystery. This is a good question. Does flipping always get you off? Does it mean you always get off from the crimes? No, it doesn't mean that at all. In fact, you may plead guilty to a lesser included offense, meaning like a slightly lower level crime. You might plead guilty to the whole crime in exchange for a lesser recommended sentence. And there are plenty of instances where people who committed crimes, right, who then turned evidence against another person still go to prison for a window of time, right? I'm going to point out here that, like this is one of the things that happened in the Manafort case, right? His partner flipped against him and that person still went to prison. So, there are plenty of examples of this, and it really depends on the individual defendant and what they can offer. Now, I'm going to tell you that I think a lot of these fraudulent electors who we know have already cut deals have probably cut deals that will not include a recommended prison sentence. They are probably going to get probation. They are probably, or if they get any time, it will be a recommendation that they serve it on house arrest. It really depends on the individual defendant. But my suspicion here is that depending on how high up this goes, the people who flip will probably still do prison time at this point, because I'm going to share one other thing with you. I kind of have no doubt that at least some of these higher level officials were given an opportunity to flip by Fani Willis and turned it down. You make your bed, you got to lie in it. So again, I would expect, for instance, that if someone like Jenna Ellis, like this news broke yesterday, that Trump's team is not paying her legal fees and she's out there trying to raise money so that she can afford a lawyer, right? That's a prime, that individual in that circumstance, or any individual in that circumstance, is a prime target for a prosecutor to flip because the expense can bankrupt them and because they're facing serious prison time. Now, do I think Jenna Ellis isn't going to go to prison if she flips? Absolutely not. I would be shocked, actually, if there is a deal cut with her, that results in her not doing prison time. Jen, okay, this is a really good question, but I have to answer it in a larger context, okay? There is a really serious issue in this country about convicted felons who have done their time never being allowed to vote again. And many of you will remember that in Florida, there was a voter initiative that passed to restore the voting rights of people who had served felony time and been released. In Florida, if that had actually been executed and not overwritten by the Florida legislature, that would have restored the voting rights of 1 in 5 Black men who live in Florida. I want to ask you to consider what that does to the voting demographics of a state like Florida, okay? I happen to be someone who believes that if you are convicted of a felony and you serve your time, your voting rights should be restored once you're released. Full stop. I don't think there should be any exceptions for that. The right to vote should not be denied to people because they committed a crime. And I feel very strongly about this, honestly. So at present, in states where it is the case that, and in California right now, they're restoring voting rights to convicted felons who have served their time, because California is on the forefront of everything. I'm just going to remind everyone, though, that, if they're convicted of felonies right now and they happen to be living in a state where they can't register to vote if they've ever been convicted of a felony, no, of course, they're not going to be able to vote. But I think that we need massive voter overhaul on this nationwide. Okay. Let's see. I answered the question already. Yes, there can be more charges filed depending on when people flip. That was a very a specific question that was asked. I was also asked whether or not courts work together on the scheduling of this. So somebody asked a question on the Patreon feed this morning that has a little bit of a kind of misinformation in it, because it's like the idea that Trump has to be present at every one of these trials. That's actually false, okay? Trump can waive his right to be present at any trial. So if he doesn't want to be in the courtroom while they're trying him, or if he has to be in DC because they're going to put him on the witness stand, Lord help us, and the trial in Georgia is happening at the same time, he can waive his right to be there. Now, I'm sure there's going to be lots of arguments made by his counsel that will seek to delay things because of potentially overlapping trial dates, but he can waive his right to be present at any time. And the other thing is there are circumstances in which a defendant can be removed from a courtroom and allowed to view a case remotely. So there are plenty of circumstances where, for instance, a violent defendant tries to attack a bailiff or a witness in the middle of trial. That defendant will not be sitting in the courtroom for the duration. They will be sitting in another location, probably in detention of some kind, watching the trial on a live feed. So how this all plays out in terms of how this is going to go is really dependent on the schedule, on what each of the individual judges rules on, and the like. Now, the question that I was asked was whether or not there is coordination potentially going on between Jack Smith and Alvin Bragg and Fani Willis and anyone else involved in the prosecution of this, other prosecutors, in terms of how to schedule all of this in some order. No one really knows. Now, I'm going to tell you, generally speaking, when there are competing federal and state cases, there's ordinarily some communication about that. It was certainly the case when I was practicing law that I saw that kind of thing happen all the time, including judges calling other judges to be like, should we try to figure this out? I don't know whether or not that's going to happen here. It really, each judge is supposed to operate independently. And, the other thing I'm just going to say here is that I think particularly when you have a state case and a state judge and a federal case and a federal judge, those two things kind of are so separate that there's an argument to be made that they should just kind of do what they want. But we're going to have to see what the motions are that are filed here by Trump's team in terms of delay and trial dates and all this other kind of stuff before we can actually determine how this is going to go. All right. Okay. So that's that. Trump going to prison. Okay. So somebody asked a question about if Trump goes to prison on one of these charges, will he still stand trial elsewhere? Yes, absolutely. Going to prison on one set of crimes and being convicted of them does not prevent you from being prosecuted elsewhere. By the way, we have a very prominent example of this in recent history. Michael Avenatti was convicted in New York of fraud and stealing from his clients. And then he stood trial in California for the same thing. It might have been the opposite way. I'm not sure if he stood trial here first and then stood trial there. But in the end, I think he pled guilty in the end to one of them, but he was tried in both locations. And that is a regular thing that kind of happens everywhere. Like, if you're a serial killer and you kill somebody in Washington State and then you kill somebody in Illinois, you damn straight are going to be prosecuted for both crimes. So he will be prosecuted for all of these, even if he's convicted for one. Right. Paul Manafort as well. Roberta, thank you for the reminder. He was tried in the Eastern District of Virginia, where I argued my first federal case. And then he was tried in the District of Columbia. So this kind of thing happens all the time. And the fact that you're convicted of one crime doesn't waive your criminal conduct in any other jurisdiction. All right. Somebody asked a question about Trump's narcissistic supply. I have spent so many broadcasts over the last 7 years talking about Trump's narcissism and his relentless, bottomless pit of need and the way in which narcissistic personality disorder with sociopathic tendencies operates in the public domain. So I'm just going to tell you all something about where we sit right now, okay? Any attention to Donald Trump is good attention, okay? He loves to be the center of attention. That's actually the reason why he can't stop himself from tweeting out abuse and threats against prosecutors and witnesses and interfering with the testimony of witnesses through what he's trying to say on social media. It's why he can't stop himself from trying to influence the jury pool. All of it feeds his narcissistic supply. The thing that he is terrified of, however, is consequences. And this is one reason why the only thing that is likely to rein him in is the threat of pretrial incarceration. Okay. Now, even with that threat, okay, he still is out there saying horrific things about Fani Willis and about Alvin Bragg and about Jack Smith and about all these other people. I mean, he's out there doing all of this as a compulsion, I think is probably the best way to describe it. I have to just point out to everyone that I would not expect any of this to end anytime soon. He is so malignant in his narcissism, and his illness is so deep that unless and until he has no access to social media at all, it will continue. That's that. Just so everybody understands, by the way, there is no insanity defense to election interference. So he's not going to be able to say, I was crazy, therefore I should be found not guilty. If he actually like descends into dementia and there is a real issue about whether or not he can assist in his own defense, there would be an opportunity for a judge facing that motion to submit him to a psychological evaluation to determine whether or not he is capable of doing that. But I'm just going to tell you, Donald Trump's narcissism is not going to allow any of his lawyers to plead insanity, or that, even if he had an insanity defense, which he doesn't, or that he is incapacitated such that he cannot assist in his own defense at any one of these trials. Okay, Samantha, to answer your question about who foots the bill, if he is within the purview of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the Federal Bureau of Prisons will pay for his travel because they will be guarding him throughout the entire time that he's being tried in another jurisdiction. However, he will be held in a local facility, and that will likely be footed by the local taxpayers. So, I have to remind everybody, I mean, this is not a day for us to talk about the prison industrial complex. You all know I have very strong feelings about this and the way in which the prison industrial complex functions, and its racism and its classism and its sexism and everything else. But once you're within the prison system, the taxpayers are footing the bill for your incarceration. So that's the answer to that. All right. Okay. Let me answer one other question here. Actually, let me answer this question first, because the next thing I'm moving on to is just a brief state issue. Big question from Matthew. Thank you for this. Is knowing what I know now, what do I believe the chance of Trump going to prison is, and how long do I think it will be for? Okay. I'm not going to speculate about how long it's going to be for, because there is an incredible amount of potential intervening events that could affect the sentencing recommendation in this case. It depends on what he's convicted of. It depends on what the judge thinks. It depends on whether or not there is a motion to deviate from the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. It depends on the pre-sentencing reports that will be filed once he's convicted, because there will be various reports issued by various authorities about whether or not he should get an upward deviation. And, the prosecutors will make their own recommendations there. I'm also just going to add that, some of it may depend on whether or not the prosecutors want him to serve time concurrently, meaning like all the things that he's convicted of overlap in a given case, or whether or not they will be served consecutively, in which case, it's endless how long he could serve. Okay. But what do I believe the chances of Trump going to prison are right now? I will tell you that I think that since this indictment dropped on Monday, those chances are extremely high. Having read this indictment now several times and being very familiar with what's happening in the DC indictment, I think there is an extremely strong chance. I mean, I would venture to say higher than 90% that he will do time in some fashion. Again, I know there are a lot of people out there, it's not in anybody's best interest to have a former president of the United States in prison. Bullshit. Ooh, sorry. I'm not supposed to swear on Twitter and on YouTube. I hope I don't get dinged for that. It impacts my circulation. But I will tell you that I really think that there is a serious consideration here that he's going to be found guilty of something. And the reality of that, particularly in light of a 41 count indictment with a RICO count with a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years, that is as detailed. I mean, this is like a 91-page indictment, something like that. I mean, it's the likelihood of him being found guilty of something in this indictment is extremely high. And then you have to add to that the compounding factors of the document case in Florida, which I don't have a lot of hope for because of the current judge, but we'll see what happens with that. The DC indictment, which is, streamlined for immediate prosecution. And then we still have the looming case by Alvin Bragg in New York City. So, I think at this point, it's an extremely high likelihood that he's going to do time. So I hope that kind of helps to answer that question. Okay. Final point for today, my friends, is that I was asked to talk about Alabama's defiance of the recent Supreme Court ruling requiring them to redistrict so that their districts are not racially gerrymandered, and to add a second majority Black district in Alabama, which the Alabama legislature has sort of like flipped the finger at the Supreme Court about. I've talked about this on the Patreon broadcast previously, and about the Alabama legislature's direct defiance of the Supreme Court's authority. I'm just going to tell you there's going to be another case about this. I am certain of it. It is going to be streamlined and speeded up through the courts of appeals to get to the Supreme Court. And I'm just going to tell you, leaving aside the fact that the Supreme Court has already ruled in a voting rights case at the very end of last term that Alabama's prior districting that only allowed for one black majority district was racially biased, they are not going to look favorably on what the Alabama legislature has done here. And in fact, I'm just going to let you all know that I would not be surprised one bit if Alabama's redistricting is removed from the Alabama legislature's authority as a result of what has happened there. But it's something to definitely watch, right? Like state defiance of a Supreme Court ruling that is supposed to guarantee the voting rights of a state, of individuals in a state. This is not going to go well for Alabama. So stay tuned on that and we will see what happens next. All right. That's it for today. Again, you have this nice little streaming ticker across the bottom here that gives you the link to subscribe to the Patreon broadcast. I will be live on the Patreon on Friday for all of our subscribers there. If you want to wait for the next public broadcast, that will be Sunday at 8:30 a.m. Pacific, 11:30 a.m. Eastern. And I will be back here from now on every Wednesday at 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern, live and public and free. And I will be back every Sunday from here on out for the foreseeable future at 8:30 a.m. Pacific, 11:30 a.m. Eastern, again, live, public, and free. However, if you want to support this group work or you want to see me 4 days a week instead of 2, you can become a subscriber over on the Patreon feed. Subscription started as little as $2 a month. And also you can, of course, tip me to support this work and to support the back-end team and all the people who work with us. We have an incredible team of 3 single mothers and 1 trans person who is doing work for us inside the atelier. All of us are self-supporting and we can use your donations and your subscriptions to benefit all of us. I really want to encourage everyone to understand that this work comes from a lot of work and a lot of effort, and it's not just me. There's a team behind the scenes that does incredible work to support me and to support our work in the world. So please support us however you can. Much love to all of you, and I will catch you all either Friday on the Patreon broadcast or here on Sunday. All right, thanks everyone. Take care. Thanks for all the great questions today. And get to work. Don't forget that we are like a mere 4.5 months from the first presidential primary. So make sure that you're getting invested right now in the get out the vote work and your organizing work and all the work that you need to do where you live. Also for your community and local elections, like right now. All right, I'll catch you all soon. Thanks for being here. Much love. Bye.